مساء الخير دكتور، كيفك؟ أنا ونورا، وبتخيل كتير من الأشخاص يلي موجودين بهالعالم يلي عم بيركزوا هلا على الإبادة اللي عم بتتم بغزة. سعيدين إنه عم نحكي مع بعض، بس بدنا نتحدث بالإنجليزي إذا أمكن. This is a podcast that is titled Long Form, and it's produced by Jadaliya. Our inspiration for these discussions is the well-known quote by Antonio Gramsci, titled, or in quote, "The old world is dying and the new world is, or struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." My name is Bassam Haddad, and together with my guest co-host Noura Erakat, are exploring this theme with a series of guests whose work has provided valuable insights into these issues. And for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with you, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah, an exceptional human being, a doctor, a physician, and a warrior in your own right. We are very lucky to have you with us, Dr. Ghassan. Ahlan wa sahlan. A very warm welcome to Long Conversations podcast. We are very much looking to this conversation, and we are going to have a long-form conversation that is pretty much conversational. There will be very little structure, and we can go wherever we'd like to go and wherever you'd like to go. I'll say a couple of words about you. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah and Professor Ghassan Abu Sittah is a multi-award winning plastic and reconstructive surgeon with a reputation as one of the world's leading specialists in craniofacial surgery, facial aesthetics, cleft lip and palate surgery, and trauma-related injuries. A beacon of courage and humanitarianism, Ghassan Abu Sittah is a prominent war surgeon who has selflessly put himself in harm's way, volunteering to treat patients in the most treacherous conflict zones throughout his career, most recently and most prominently in Gaza. He has championed the cause of war-injured patients, particularly children, with an indomitable spirit and a firm stance for human rights and the freedom of Palestine. I will start by the question we ask everyone, which is, in your mind, in your opinion, are we experiencing a transformation or disintegration of the international order? Or is this order experiencing yet one more challenge from which it will recover and perhaps emerge stronger than before? Are we going to go back to business as usual? So we put this question to everyone, and I would love to put it to you.
So there's no doubt that Western imperialism is jettisoning a lot of the tools of the trade. From the founding myths of the Western liberal state that came about after the Second World War, which is human rights, rules-based world order, ICC, ICJ, all of these tools of Western liberalism that were used to justify a lot of imperialist interventions are literally being set alight by Western governments in order to not protect Israel, just this racial colony, but also protect the genocidal project and ensure its longevity. And in this process of setting fire to its tools, one cannot but ask, what do they expect to do in the day after? How will Europe and North America conduct foreign policy without the tools that they've used over the last 50, 60 years? How will they conduct their war against Russia, conduct their war against China, devoid of these mechanisms? Now, what we've also witnessed is that the genocide and the support of Western governments to the genocide has acted as a vehicle that hastened the arrival of the far right into the mainstream and into rule in the United States, in Germany, and even in the United Kingdom, where the center has shifted so far to the right that even those parties that pretend to be center centrist parties are actually, when you think about it, are on the far right of parties as existed 20, 30 years ago. Now, structurally, I believe that the biggest challenge facing global capital is that of surplus populations. And we see in Palestine, politically surplus Palestinians are being erased through genocidal means. And in the global north, economically surplus populations are witnessing a social murder through austerity measures, through denial of access to healthcare, denial of access to welfare, which aims at shortening their lives. And we have medical literature that shows life expectancy in certain parts of the United Kingdom or amongst certain populations in the United States that are almost a decade difference between them and the richer part of the population. And so within the political economy of global capitalism, there is a problem that parts of the population are no longer economically desirable and therefore are surplus to need. And politically, globally, for the imperialist project to function, there are politically surplus populations like the Palestinians who have to be erased.
I want to obviously center our work in Gaza as it's ethical, it's responsible, but I want to pick up on this strand really quickly, just to maybe highlight some of the connections that you're making. You're suggesting to us that there is a relationship between this program of removing surplus populations and the way that Gaza has almost primed audiences to allow it. Not only has it primed audiences to allow it, but it's given an opportunity for these far right, as you describe them, political parties to come to power. How would you trace that? Do you think that this was an opportunity that they jumped on? Or do you think that this is racism that they're taking advantage of, an anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim racism that they're taking advantage of to drive their agendas home?
So there's no doubt that, as we saw before the 7th of October, Zionism had crossed that Rubicon in elimination to using genocidal means. And we saw that in Hawara and the pogroms that were increasing in intensity and in frequency in the West Bank. Also, there is no doubt that the issue of surplus population and the problem with economically surplus population we were witnessing already in the austerity measures in the West, in the almost the kind of return to Victorian language about the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, to justify social murder within government spending, and the complete othering of socially surplus populations, which are the migrants and the refugees crossing the Mediterranean, and, as we became fully aware, intentionally being drowned in the Mediterranean by European naval ships. What Gaza has allowed them to do through the performative violence of the genocide and the intentionally performative violence of the genocide is the brutalization of the population who has been watching this and creating an acceptable level of brutality that anything that falls now below Gaza feels as something not deserving of the description of a war or a crime, because we've been taken to the very end of what is imaginable in terms of brutality. And what it's also allowed, this brutalism, is the normalization of the anti-humanist tendency within the new right. And we see it in the discourse of the American right. This anti-humanism is critical. And the way there's now almost a kind of synchronous symbiosis between Zionism and the far right in the West, the far right in the West celebrating the slaughter of people of color, and Zionism deciding to redefine what anti-Semitism is in order to gain access to that political support. And so we saw the Anti-Defamation League describe Elon Musk's Sieg Heil Nazi salute as an awkward shoulder movement. So suddenly you have a situation in which that is coming together as a result of the brutalism and the performative violence that's been taking place in Gaza.
You know, ironically or not, it's also the work on, this very far-right government that wants to protect a Jewish racial minority. It's in the name of protection that they're actually, committing these atrocities. And in the same moment that you mentioned the ADL, for example, when they came to support the Trump administration's deportation, that here is a racial group that has insisted that they are the epitome of a refugee crisis that is now advocating for the deportation of immigrants. I mean, it's loaded, it's very loaded, and the anti-humanism is also loaded with this movement for the transhuman, the replacing of our economic surplus populations with robots. But, so we come back to the source, to Gaza. And I just want to start there. You were there, you arrived on October 9th, you were ready to go. When you were there, you coined for us the acronym of Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. There's so much there, but I guess just by putting it in context of the world, how does it compare to other sites of mass atrocities that you've actually been to and treated? How has Gaza marked an exception to those other sites where you have provided your medical expertise?
It's the difference between a flood and a tsunami. If you remember the tsunami of 2005, watching these waves as they approach the Indonesian and Sri Lankan beaches and hotels, and seeing this wall that completely engulfed people, and comparing it to a flood that kind of passes through. That's the scale. But there's another layer to this, which is the selective component of this wave, this tsunami of killing, which is the targeting of health facilities from the very beginning. So there were two parallel military campaigns happening in Gaza from the very outset, from the 12th of October. One was an immediate kill as many as you can. And one was the systematic destruction of all of the aspects of life in Gaza, even those that had no immediate benefit. So immediately, the water desalination plants were hit. Immediately, the sewage treatment plants were hit. Immediately, there was a systematic assassination program against doctors. From early October, we started seeing colleagues being killed. Then, within half an hour of going home from a shift in Shifa, we lost our colleague in the plastic surgery department, Midhat Saydam. His house was hit, he was killed. Hammam al-Lawh, the nephrologist, gets home within half an hour, he's killed. And every day and then immediately you start realizing it's a much higher percentage than the general population. And then you start hearing of a similar process happening with university academics and deans. And so there is a kind of immediate slaughter, but there's a genocidal project that is laying the seeds for a much more, or laying the seeds for a genocidal project where everything can be weaponized to kill people. We see it now in full blast. People are not just dying of the bombs and the bullets, they're dying of starvation, they're dying because there are non-communicable diseases like high blood pressure and diabetes are not being treated. They're dying because of infectious diseases, because the sewage and water treatment plants have been destroyed. They're dying of illnesses because of the over 34 million tons of rubble in Gaza with all the toxicity. 40% of dialysis patients have died not of traumatic deaths, but of all of this together. And so you see that coming to fruition now, but the seeds for that genocidal project were sown at the very beginning of the war.
It's so, we've read, obviously so much time has passed, many methods have been exposed, the different AI technologies, where's Daddy, Lavender, and the such, that all tell us about this aggregate data that's been used to basically fire recklessly, right? Which is above negligence, to be as tantamount, just short of targeting. But you're describing something else, which is that from the beginning it was obvious that they wanted to take out those who can sustain life. And we actually saw sort of seeds of that, because Gaza has been the site of large-scale assaults since 2008 to the present. And we saw in 2014 the 51-day assault, which was unprecedented at the time of experimenting with weapons. And then by 2021, what we saw, I think, was the beginning of this, the targeting of towers. So the war, Hurub al-Abraj, which almost signaled that this was going to happen next. Was there any kind of awareness that this, what this was going to be in that moment? Was that shaping how you were understanding it under fire? Or was it just the experience of it? And empirically, your colleagues are being targeted, friends are being targeted.
So the 21 war, there was a lot of targeting of doctors. And we saw the killing of the head of internal medicine in Shifa, a disproportionate number of doctors for a war that only lasted 8 or 9 days. We also saw this idea of taking out whole families. So 54 families were removed from the civil register, i.e. grandchildren, parents, and grandparents were killed. 54, now we're into 2,700. There were tactics that were being used that are now strategies. And the weaponization of infrastructure. The weaponization of the destruction of water and sewage as a form of killing was being kind of played around with in the different wars. One of the biggest failures of Palestinian intelligentsia and the political elite is failing to see and understand and foresee the inevitability of the genocidal moment in Zionist elimination. The way international relations logic seeped into Palestinian thinking and corroded our ability to understand Israel as a colonial project with the logic of elimination and the inevitability of genocidal elimination. I think that stands to one of the failures of modern Palestinian political thinking. Despite the fact that we know that, Sayegh wrote about this in the 60s, and then we had this complete divergence of what I call the geographic logic at the expense of the ideological logic. So we are no longer talking about the need to defeat Zionism as the ruling ideology of Israel, and talking about the geography. And therefore the Israelis were able to take us down a rabbit hole until you came to Oslo, where you were discussing side roads and who gets which side of the street and who gets what suburb. But that's because what this logic allowed us to think is that you can coexist with Zionism as an ideology.
I obviously want to pivot back to Bassam, but on this point in specific, I take it that there was a failure to see this moment in Zionist thinking, although I think that it's intimated in a lot of the literature, especially there's a literature of indigenous studies that Palestinians have produced, distinct from settler colonial studies, which has understood this. But one of the things, and I'll say that, it was one of the things that has shocked me, and it's where we start in this conversation. Who would have anticipated that all of the guardrails would have been blown off in this moment, that all of this logic about, liberalism in itself is basically burning itself in order to fulfill this Zionist project. I think that's where, I'll be the first, that's where I couldn't have anticipated this moment.
We are a product of that Palestinian thinking. And I think, knowing something and being fully aware of it are two separate things. We've always, all of us, or a lot of us, believed that it was the dog that wags the tail and not the tail that wags the dog. And that that Israel is a settler colony, a racial settler colony that answers to its metropole, and that the West is the metropole. But we were taken down this rabbit hole when we agreed into this assimilationist idea that our national aspirations were to be another third world country that is accepted by the West and proves itself useful to the West, and that's how you get your independence. That process allowed us to have bizarre conversations about European foreign policy and trying to find the difference between European foreign policy and American foreign policy, or trying to explain that somehow, imperialism is a misunderstanding and better Palestinian PR would have solved the issue of all of this.
If I had a dime for every time.
Absolutely. And I remember these bizarre conversations in the 70s and 80s about Arafat's accent. Somehow that if he'd spoken better, that the Palestinians would have been getting a better deal from the American administration. At the end of the day, this is a colonial project, and Israel is a racial colony that in a lot of ways behaves very similar. And more interestingly, and I think for me, that is the kind of gasp moment in this war, is how disposable the Israelis are as colonists to the West. So we've been fed the lie about the sanctity with which they hold the lives of their soldiers, the lives of their dead, that Israel cannot withstand the kind of losses that other countries can. And now we see, especially in the last month or so, on average 3 to 4 Israeli soldiers being killed every day, and the war continuing, because like the settlers that were sent to North America and the settlers that were sent to Australia, they were lesser citizens of the metropole than their counterparts that stayed behind.
Dr. Ghassan, I want to ask about a couple of questions that might be related. The second one will be your immediate impulse to actually go to Gaza right after October 7th. And we had talked about this together. I would like you to talk about this second, but first, if you can tell us in comparative perspective, in a bit more detail, in general, how would your experience in Gaza compare to other events, atrocities, tragedies, calamities that you have actually observed, witnessed, and worked within in the past decades?
So to start out with, at no stage in the previous wars, including the 2014, which had been until then the most severe war that I had been in, had I felt that the hospital was the front line, the battleground. And in this war, you really felt that the hospital was the battle. From the massacre of the 17th of October in Al-Ahli Hospital, and then every day after that, you really felt that this is where the battle was happening. And, the nights where we were, after they surrounded Al-Ahli, when we would close multiple doors when we went to sleep in Al-Ahli Hospital, after they surrounded Shifa, and I was isolated in Al-Ahli, and we could hear the quadcopters coming into the hospital and going around the hospital. That for me had never been an experience. Interestingly enough, yeah, I felt that during the war in Lebanon, Israel's war in Lebanon, when they were bombing the hospitals here, and they were gradually following a very similar modus operandi of killing ambulance people, killing field hospitals, and then bombing the roads leading into hospitals, and then bombing the buildings close to a hospital with such a large bomb that all of the rubble would, and then eventually they would bomb a hospital. That's the first one. The second one is the sheer scale of it has never been described. Maybe in terms of numbers per day in the First World War or in some of the Iraq-Iran war battles, just the sheer number. I mean, an air raid that brings 800 wounded from Jabalia to and you would be in a room, or which is a huge room of the emergency department in Shifa Hospital, and you had patients on the floors, on the desks, on the chairs, everything, it's just that sense of being submerged by this wave of human suffering and screaming and wailing and the smell of flesh and the smell of burnt clothes, but just on a scale that after 30 years of doing this kind of work, I had never seen. It just had, I mean, it's overwhelming. And when I wrote about the wounded child, it's because what catches your eye in all of this screaming is a child on a stretcher that's not surrounded by any screaming and is quiet, and everything around them is deadly quiet. And they might be have a tube and be on a ventilator, but there's no one around them. And so that starts to attract you. And it's funny, there's a term that Fanon uses, where places where life is lived at unbearable temperatures. And it's that moment when you're in that setting, life is lived at unbearable temperatures.
Just a quick follow-up. While you were in Gaza, before I ask you about the immediate trip that you embarked on, and you were witnessing these untold, I don't know what to say, these images, these realities, did it make a difference, or did it affect you that what you're witnessing in front of you, the incessant killing, is viewed by a good portion of the world where we all live, in the West, here, we all three of us at least, that it was viewed as a different kind of thing as opposed to the rest of the world? Did this make a difference at any point? Maybe not at the point of action, maybe, but how did that strike you, that there is a portion of human beings that sees this differently?
I saw it and I understood it from the kind of questions that I was being asked by Western journalists on a nightly basis. So you'd be treating pieces of children left from air raids all day, and then you get a phone call to do an interview for CNN or BBC to be asked if I'd seen any Hamas gunmen, or did I know where the hostages were, and had I seen any of the tunnels underneath Shifa. And then I realized that is when I kind of, it kind of goes back to your understanding of ungrievability and the racialization of Palestine, and the idea that is so rich in African American anti-racist literature, which is white unseeing. That white unseeing is an active process where you can not see actively the slaughter of thousands of children without flinching, and by insisting on asking about those humans that matter to you, which are the white European settlers.
I did an interview on PBS after the bombing of the first tent massacre, where children were burnt alive or asphyxiated by plastic tents. And I wanted to get past the cold language that we can use intellectually or even legally to describe that to the broadcaster, the anchor, who responded with a question of, but what do I make of how 6 million Jews feel about Hamas? So just to your point, I mean, first of all, how inaccurate is that question? Because they're Israelis. But to the point of the worst possible thing that can happen to anybody's babies is happening.
But what he's telling you is not...
Unfortunately.
What she's telling you is, I want you to accept the racial ladder
100%.
and accept your place in the racial ladder.
And what's necessary.
And so at the very beginning of all of the interviews, I understood the question as saying, let us put the different colors of the people in the different rungs of the racial ladder so that we can start a conversation, so that maybe towards the conversation, if you show me that you're a victim enough, I can move you to maybe up one rung, but that's it. Because, one of the most devastating things while in Gaza and after Gaza, especially living in the UK, is the realization, had the Israelis killed that many kittens, Western audiences would have been absolutely livid. They would have been apocalyptic about their response. But it is what the success of the genocide is the way that Israel was able to tap into the essence of European, and what I mean by European, old European and new European identity. We have to accept that colonialism is a formative moment in European identity. Europeans became Europeans in 1750 when the Spanish statelets joined and then sent Christopher Columbus. That's when Europeans became Europeans. And with that colonial formative part, the genocidal instinct is a critical part of European identity. It is the only thing that, and what proves it is the Holocaust. The fact that Europe accepted that or decided that the Holocaust was a genocide, but not the Namibian genocide was a genocide that was committed by the Germans and took out 80% of the Namibian population, or the 10 million Congolese was not a genocide, established or protected for its use in Gaza the idea of the acceptability of genocide as long as it's not committed against other white people.
And it becomes a genocide when it happens within Europe's shores. I mean, that's
precisely then it becomes a genocide.
Then it becomes a genocide. Although, in that case, they understand full well that genocide is a story about their identity, but not when it's happening against others. I just want to pick up on this point that you were sharing with us now in regards to kittens versus our babies. And I mean, here we pick up on the idea of the demanding, and I remember I wrote this on October 10th, 2023, the violence of demanding perfect victims, right? The narrative, they'll accept and they'll feel bad. They'll say it, we feel bad and have sympathy for these children. But somehow it's our fault because of Hamas. And bringing in and weaving in Hamas into the story. Now, what's horrifying about that, aside from the obvious, is that they know nothing about Hamas, and that even discussing its history, its establishment, its distinction from other formations that might, have some sort of Islamic ideology, is not only that they don't know, but it becomes forbidden to talk about.
And it's inconsequential, because I've had 9 complaints and legal cases against me, all triggered by or actually instigated by UK Lawyers for Israel, which is an organization in the UK that openly says it's part of the lawfare against those opposed to Israel. And the accusation was support of Hamas, support of terrorism, and anti-Semitism. Trying to argue against the idea that ideologically I cannot possibly be a supporter of a religious political party was inconsequential. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter. By virtue of color, you support Hamas or you don't support Hamas. Not by virtue of ideology, where you stand with regards to theology, where you stand with regards to the relationship between religion and politics. That's indifferent. If you're brown, and you're Muslim, then there's a good chance you support Hamas. And now, even if you're white and you're not Muslim, supporting the Palestinians means supporting. It doesn't matter. They write the rules of discourse as they go along, and you have to accept them. And as you said, your margin is that of victimhood, but that's it.
So this gets.
I want to go back to the question of kittens.
Okay.
In 2002, when the media was in full throttle, regurgitating and reproducing the government discourse in America in terms of invading Iraq, or collecting this all this evidence that proved to be fraudulent and false, not just false but also fraudulent. I had written something about, right before we actually went to Iraq. You probably know, we went to Iraq, we made a film. We were the first team to enter Iraq right after the invasion, and we made a film about what was happening there. I had written something for which I was yelled at and screamed about. It was like in a small note somewhere at the time, that if you filled Baghdad with kittens and puppies, there would be an uproar against the war. It's very interesting that we're thinking along the same lines in terms of this dehumanization of.
It's not just you, actually. There's thanks to social media, I know this
about the donkeys in Gaza.
Not quite. Do you want to tell me about that first?
So there is a piece of news in one of the Israeli newspapers that the Israelis have been saving donkeys out of Gaza and sending them to a donkey sanctuary in France. But there is a similar story which actually did happen for I think donkeys and a donkey sanctuary from Afghanistan when the Americans withdrew. The British helped transport some of these donkeys.
I hadn't seen that. I saw a Vietnamese student in the United States at an Ivy League school who put out a poster who said, at 1 p.m. I'm going to burn a dog in front of this, the library. So 1,000 students showed up to protest. And in that moment, he said to them, you need to show this same amount of compassion for the Vietnamese who are being slaughtered by American empire. I want to pick up on this idea of race. I mean, we're getting into a conversation about, category of the human, about species and whatnot.
And the lack of evolution within Western identity.
Maybe you can tell me about that. That wasn't my question. Go ahead.
No. I mean, one of the things that we've encountered in this genocide is that Western institutions that had been built on slavery and then built with slavery money, or built on colonialism and colonial theft, and built with the aim of advancing colonialism, and had spent the last 5 years wanting to decolonize everything from their soft furnishings to their curricula to their what they offered in the cafeteria to everything, in this genocide proved to be true to their original form, that these were colonial, racializing institutions that functioned again now as they did 150 years ago when they were set up.
Although I think the genius of them is to occlude that identity. Is to occlude the identity.
They did for a long time until they had to now. Yes.
Until now, and that's what it is. I was going to ask a different question, and this actually gets into something that I've noticed in your own writing. But as you tell us, this idea that we were talking about Hamas and how it's treated, it's for me for anybody that's critical, infuriating that after 648 days, there's still horror that, about what Hamas did on October 7th, and yet 648 days of beheaded children, burned alive, never leans into the monstrosity of the West, let's say, because it's, particularly of Zionists, but also of the broader West. It indicates that the problem is this ontological kind of belief that nothing the Israelis do can shift them out of being victims, and nothing Palestinians do can shift them from being culpable. Right?
But it's also about the racial ratio. That there is no point in which your life will be equal to that of an Israeli, and therefore there's no tipping point where the balance would shift in your favor.
Where we can have this conversation.
If enough of you were killed, there's no point in which this could happen.
Even arithmetics don't matter.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, to go back to kind of Western identity, what this genocide has allowed is for the soldiers and the prison guards of Abu Ghraib to move from Abu Ghraib to the White House. And that was the reason, what I was talking about, how it became a vehicle for that. And the logic of that, the logic of Abu Ghraib turns out to be the logic of the West. But you no longer needed to keep that hidden in the dungeons of Abu Ghraib. You can now have a defense minister who has walked literally, it looks like he's walked out of Abu Ghraib from torturing and tormenting naked Iraqis to becoming defense minister.
I mean, I think it would be really ironic for a lot of young people to know that it was actually pictures from Abu Ghraib that catapulted, right, an American public as well as a Supreme Court to decide that they had, jurisdiction that, over these atrocities, versus in this moment, there's not even that possibility because of how far right everything is shifted. But back to the race question. Yes, the arithmetics, the value of life, but the thing that you're also telling us about is something that we know is universal, and it's one of the things that's reflected in your work. If anybody reads you, it's obvious, you're reading a lot of critical thinkers and race thinkers. And you had shared with us that there was a moment in which you actually shifted, that your reading of race literature was a moment that happens when you shift from reading medical books to another literature. Can you describe that shift for us and why it was relevant to your own work?
My theoretical reading was always, until probably 2011, Marxist in nature. I had grown up within that tradition, and where I went to university, there was a strong left-wing trade unions in Glasgow. It was a big industrial city. It was a left-wing city. And it wasn't until 2011, and I moved back to Beirut, and I started treating Iraqi patients wounded from the different wars in Iraq. And then after the Syrian war, started seeing wounded Syrian patients and seeing some of the patients from the Lebanese Civil War, that I started looking for more nuanced lenses with which to understand what I was seeing. It was why different patients were coming to me and others were not. How do you understand the wound as an archive of war? How do you see the political capital inherent in wounds? And that kind of set me off in a trajectory with the help of my research collaborator, Omar Dewachi, who helped guide me down this road of trying to understand beyond the kind of classical Marxist-Leninist teaching that places economy first and foremost, and understanding things, and trying to see a nuanced, with more visual acuity of lenses than what I had been trained to do. And then what happens is, with every war, you come back with a million questions. And then you start looking for those lenses that allow you to read what you witnessed, like the Marches of Return, which I had seen as an act of mutilation. 8,000 young men, mainly shot in the legs intentionally. The interview that the snipers did were ha'arts, in which they were saying that they had a board in which every day they wrote how many knees they had taken and who had won the competition for the day in the number of knees, and trying to understand mutilation, trying to understand the body, and trying to understand the relationship between mutilation and where it lies within colonial history and disablement. And so you follow what you see in the clinic. You try to kind of see the full dimensional or the full multi-dimensional aspect of it by looking for those theoretical lenses that allow you to see different sides of it, to understand it.
You had said, actually, you brought up a really pointed critique of King Leopold's mutilation and practices and the continuity with the present.
So we know that in the Congo, King Leopold, which considered the Congo as a private piece of land, punished rubber farmers who failed to make the quota by chopping off the hands of their children. And we know that still now in the streets of Antwerp, sweet shops sell chocolate hands. And it had, as part of trying to understand mutilation, I mean, the thing is that plastic surgery is the surgery of returning the body to form and function after injury. And so it's very much centered in the flesh, and trying to understand that dimension of mutilation as the alteration of the flesh without the intent to end life. So unlike other military activity, the mutilation aims at keeping the victim alive, but in an altered state. And in a state that the body's form is determined by the oppressor, which then creates an immediate alienation in the victim between them and their altered body, because they no longer own that shape, and sometimes they no longer recognize that shape because it's owned by the Israeli who shot you in the back of the knee, knowing that in the last 10 centimeters at the bottom of your thigh, the nerve and the artery and the joint meet, and so that bullet will take out those three. Or in the pager attack, which was where the explosive device was calibrated not to kill, and then the pager went off, and giving enough time for it to be picked up and placed in the face before it explodes, so that it would mark the face, take out the eyes, and amputate the digits, but not kill, and could have easily been altered to kill. But then, so you try to understand what mutilation is as someone who's working with mutilation, to undo mutilation as a plastic surgeon, but you need to understand why it's done and how it functions.
I never thought about the way that the alienation from the body becomes that what it means for the aggressor. Now it becomes a relationship to the aggressor who mutilated the body. So thank you for that. Also in your study, you had mentioned that so much of this reading had also taken you to Black feminist literature. And last week I heard you actually cite Toni Morrison in that work. And so has that also been part of shaping the way that you've approached this question?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, that has been an extremely rich source of trying to understand the body and flesh and color, and the way they are used to create captives of their victims, and whether it's Audrey Winters or Bell Hooks or a lot of these writers really have, some of whom have unpronounceable names. Some have been very important for me to try to. Yes. Habeas viscus. And I'm sure when they wrote them, they didn't think that a plastic surgeon would find them interesting. But in plastic surgery, you do deal with the flesh, you do deal with form and function, and you do deal with the idea of where aesthetic is functional and where aesthetic is not functional.
This actually goes back to something else that you had been saying about the body, the flesh, and the relationship between land and flesh and marking the colonial encounter. So how does that, just taking the body back to the land, what is the relationship between that and the way that you've been thinking about it in colonial violence?
So settler colonialism starts the day after the land is occupied. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it aims, or it's obsessed with eternity. The French were convinced that they were going to be in Algeria forever. The Israelis think that the Israeli state will remain forever. And therefore, that longevity or that obsession with eternity means that the body of the indigenous population becomes the battleground. Disabling it, weakening it, marking it. And the obstacle. And breaking it. And that's, I think now I think one of the many tragedies that we've had is the premature death of Fanon, because I think that he was following that intellectual track down that road before he died in his early 30s. And I think that is another intellectual thread that had been lost when he passed away. It's really kind of important for us to see this idea of breaking the consciousness, in which the nice thing about the Israelis is that they articulate their genocidal, their colonial desires because of this sense of absolute impunity. They're like a disinhibited alcoholic, where they will tell you exactly. And so, this term kay al-wa'i, which is branding or searing consciousness through war and physically altering consciousness through war, which is a military term that the Israelis used to justify their wars on Gaza. That is exactly what the aim of that violence against the body of the indigenous population aims at: creating that alienation within yourself, creating that enfeebled sense of yourself, and most importantly, and this is the psychopathy of also articulated by Trump, the settlers' sense of omnipotence, that they will inherit the earth. They are the rulers of the earth. And we saw that in the AI-generated video that Trump made. It is the best expression of white settler deity, sense of deity that we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm. An excess of fantasy. An excess of fantasy which is also the immortality.
Absolutely.
Of the self.
I would like to go back to the second question, because we actually because we were having a really important thread, and this is supposed to be conversational because it's a precursor to another question about medicine and the nature of medicine in these contexts. So when you decided to go to Gaza, it was like literally maybe moment after?
1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon.
Can you tell us a little bit about that moment? What you found out, how you found out, and how you decided, and then when you arrived, can you tell us a little bit about that journey and what was going through your mind, and whether what you saw was what you were thinking about, what you were anticipating?
So, as an insomniac, I'm up usually around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And then it was Saturday, and I was in London, and I had spent 2 months that summer working in Gaza on a project training plastic surgeons at Shifa. And I got back in August, and Dima and the boys got back in September. And I woke up and I turned on the TV and, pottering around, and just slowly on the outside of your field of vision, you start noticing on TV that there's something bizarre happening, and it was unfolding. And by 1 o'clock, I'd realized that what was about to happen at that stage was a worse version of 2014 in my mind, that this is going to be worse than 2014. And I had gotten in touch with a very good and close friend at MSF she was still running the Middle East cell at MSF. And I said, what had been happening is the Israelis had been preventing humanitarian teams going in through areas. So I said, listen, I can get in through Rafah. Let me get in through Rafah. If I'm in, then you can say that you had sent me as a volunteer. So by Sunday morning, I was on the flight to Cairo, and then at 4 o'clock in the morning, you get a taxi to Rafah. And got in on the Monday morning. I was outside Rafah at 7 o'clock in the morning. At 8, when it opened, I went in. I was through by 11 o'clock. By 1 o'clock, the Israelis bombed Rafah. I got to my uncle's house in Gaza, and I thought that's where because it's walking distance from Shifa, I thought I'll stay there, it's comfortable. And then every day, as I did in the 2014 war, I'll walk to Shifa. Within half an hour, the whole neighborhood was in the streets. They were evacuating. There was an evacuation. Remember, Rimal was bombed the first night. So we had to move to another cousin's house, and then we got pinned down that night. There was 300 air raids. So I didn't make it into Shifa Hospital until the Tuesday, the 10th. And I remember walking in through the gates of Shifa and running into Dr. Abu Salmiya, who had been arrested, and Dr. Abu Rish, and Dr. Marwan Abu Sa'da, who's still there, and them joking, saying, we only know that it's really bad when we see you. So that was my entry, and I stayed in the system until I left, literally. We moved around in ambulances, but I'd never, I slept in a trolley in the operating room for the duration of the war.
We were watching you throughout, so many of us, on television, on social media, and until today, as you know, in the past few weeks, every day we have an average of 100 Palestinians killed by Israel, many of them seeking food. And then we see what's happening at the hospital. We see what's happening at the hospital, but we don't see, most of the time, who's filming and how they're filming and how they're documenting. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience when you are dealing with, what is unfathomable right in front of you, and there's cameras and people trying to document? Can you just tell us about this dynamic? What does it do? Is it disturbing? Is it something that you just are used to? Is it something that you have any qualms about? I'm just interested because we were in previous modes, we were in quote unquote danger zones when we were filming, for instance, in Iraq or Palestine or Lebanon. But I was never in a situation like this where you're immediately dealing with victims, especially children. Can you tell us about that dynamic at hospitals in terms of the documentation Is it something that you support? Is it something that you think can go too far? Or
So in the emergency room, you just see them out the corner of your eye. You're so focused on the person that you're treating and making sure that there are not others that need more urgent attention. And you see these cameras and they're kind of trying to move around you. In terms of more intrusive interviews, you try to accommodate, but sometimes you're angry. If the world hasn't figured it out by now, another 10 seconds of footage is not, another screaming child is not gonna, it's not gonna turn things around. And it's funny, it's this idea of unseeing. I think the problem is that Palestinians have not figured out unseeing. One of the images from the press conference, and I remember seeing this guy and this, if you remember, I was on the podium and there were lots of bodies and there was this guy holding his baby's beheaded body in front of the cameras, and he would move in front of the cameras thinking that if the world only sees. And I remember seeing him doing this, and I remember thinking of The Invisible Man, which is a novel that came out in the 1920s, and the first novel that talked about how racist white unseeing is an active thing, and that this poor man doesn't realize that there's a skill of unseeing. That they don't. It wasn't by mistake that the world hasn't seen his beheaded child. If he puts his beheaded child in front of the camera for the following week, the world will still unsee his child.
And then imaginarily see beheaded children that were not even beheaded.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it goes hand in hand.
so that brings me to another question about, and for those of us who are not steeped in these concepts and terminology, the difference, if you can tell us a little bit about the difference between humanitarian medicine and liberation medicine, which I know that you address, and can you tell us a bit more about this distinction?
So if you think about the idea that grew out in the second part of, especially in the second part of the 20th century, that the provision of healthcare was always considered either an adjunct to revolution or part of revolutionary struggle. And the attacks on health workers were part of the repression against them. So, and this is something I only found out a few days ago when I was reading a book about the history of the Algerian Revolution, is that the French, there were 25 Algerian doctors when the revolution started in 58. By 61, the French had disappeared 7 of them, publicly executed 2, and drove 12 out of clinical practice. So liberation medicine had grown initially within the Palestinian and Lebanese sphere in the 50s from the generation that had been studying medicine in the region, in Cairo, in the AUB. And then when they graduated, they discovered that their nation was a nation of refugees, and there were all of these clinics that were providing free healthcare in Haddad, in the Lebanese camps here. And then it started to evolve with the evolution of the PLO and the Palestine Red Crescent Society as a formative part and a founding part of the PLO. And then the whole experience of the PLO in the 60s and 70s in Lebanon, with the siege of Tel al-Zatar and the massacre of Tel al-Zatar and the role that the doctors played in the siege of Tel al-Zatar. And then in the south, the hospitals in the south, in Nabatiyeh, in Bint Jbeil, and how that and the volunteers that were coming from the European left as a form of solidarity. The provision of healthcare as a form of solidarity, and for Palestinians, the provision of healthcare as a part of the struggle and a tool to mobilize the Palestinian people as part of the struggle. And we saw that how, despite 82 and then the end of the PLO here, it then reappeared in the first intifada in the form of the medical relief committees and the health workers committees as an intrinsic part of the struggle of the first intifada. And at the same time, globally, you had the idea articulated by Che Guevara that actually health has to wait for the revolution to succeed. And as a doctor, he forsake his medical career because he believed that real health will only happen once the revolution succeeds. And then you had that evolution into the work that Fanon did, in which he centered provision of healthcare as part of the liberation struggle. And then with his demise and the growth of humanitarianism, you had the idea that actually real humanitarian medicine had to be neutral and not take sides. And then it kept morally eroding until it became a justification for imperial intervention in Somalia. And now you can humanitarianize the genocide, and we can see humanitarianism actually coexisting with genocide. This idea that there is no conflict between humanitarian activity and an ongoing, fully fledged genocide. And that humanitarian organizations can, in all faith, claim that they're making a difference in the middle of a genocide, as they do in their ads towards their funders. Liberation medicine views the act of the provision of healthcare as a central part of the struggle, particularly in colonial struggles where the politics of death and the politics of erasure and the politics of the destruction and the dismantlement of the indigenous body are central to colonial violence, and the politics of healing and strengthening that body are part of the politics of the resistance. And that in order to engage in the medicine as a form of solidarity, there are certain conditions. Respect for sovereignty, not just individual sovereignty, but collective sovereignty of the Palestinians, that you place yourself at the service of the Palestinians, not try to create parallel systems that undermine the sovereignty of Palestinians, that you are part of a struggle, as opposed to some bizarre notion that you're neutral to the struggle, that you accept as a Westerner that you are complicit by virtue of where you come from and the government to whom you're paying your taxes in the slaughter of these people, and that your presence is there to strengthen and amplify their struggle rather than to save them. And that this solidarity aims at allowing them to continue their struggle. And that medical assistance that you might provide is only effective if it can prolong their resistance to their oppression, because the health consequences of that oppression can only end if the oppression ends.
Can I just capture that? I think, because I've been thinking about it as well, that here the primary distinction is not merely to save a life, but prolong the possibility and the potential to resist.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
I want to ask a quick follow-up before I'll give Noura the last word, because طولنا عليك, we kept you for too long. So this is a difficult question for me, at least. When you observe children, especially the preteen, because they're, the way they process information is on average a little different than, 14 and over or 13 over. Like little kids, when they wake up from surgery and they discover that they're missing limbs, I don't know if this is a question, it's just on my mind. It's been on my mind. How do they process what they are observing in the omission in their body? I mean, I don't know if this is something that is even...
But have they even had anesthesia?
Initially, they were getting anesthetic. So I'll tell you, some of them think that it'll grow back. Some of them cannot process the loss of their parents in order to be able to you see, children at that age know danger by reading their parents' faces rather than by assessing their own injury. And therefore, the screaming is for the parent so that they can tell them if this is the right thing or the wrong thing to happen. That's the devastating thing. Or it's okay. Or it'll be okay. So that's the most devastating thing. And the other thing is, when we were running out of anesthetic, we were using a lot of ketamine. Ketamine is a World War I medication that now is used as a veterinary anesthetic, but it's still the go-to anesthetic in wars, especially when you have no resources. And the problem with it is, as you wake up from the anesthetic, you have flashbacks of the injury. And so you hear them screaming through the whole episode of the bombing.
As if it was happening.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a lot to sit with. That's a lot to sit with. I often think, and it's been a refrain of mine, that what is it that we, how do we make sense of this to a child who's been pulled out of the rubble with 2 limbs and no parents?
Yes. 36,000 orphans. 16,000 both parents.
And that's not even if they're,
Yes.
no surviving family, no siblings, nobody to process this with. Yeah. The gravity of that has been very, very, very heavy. I often get frustrated by folks who use that to say, wait till you see the wrath of these children. And it's like, why are we abstracting this pain?
Our pain is only of relevance to them if it becomes a threat to their lives. Somehow it's only a problem because there's a potential that in 20 years' time these kids will come back and represent a danger to the well-being of the West. That's the only value that they ascribe to their suffering. Their lives of suffering are only of value because they come from intrinsically violent cultures. And so there's no way that anything other than that.
Mm-hmm. Your concept in focusing Zionism as a sister of white supremacy and of apartheid, but here we can draw on other race thinkers who describe what you're saying as interest convergence, that this becomes significant because of the threat that it can pose to them and a shared interest. But I do think that just sitting with that pain and that loss is enough even for us. I want to shift actually to thinking about you as a child. And what I had assumed was your first rebellion was sending you to your father sends you to boarding school, and then you successfully run away. But you corrected me. This is in fact not your first rebellion as a child.
As an extremely conformist child, I had 2 rebellions. I was an extremely, one of the ways I always hid my political activism from my family was doing very well at school. And so my first rebellion was in the summer of '82, which for our generation was the formative summer. For our generation, it was the formative summer. And I remember, I had saved up money from Eid like everybody else. And I went to the PLO office in Kuwait to volunteer to come to Beirut. And I was 13, barely 13. I was turning 13 that July, and it happened at the end of June that I decided to go. And I hadn't factored into that my father, who had been a well-established pediatrician in Kuwait from the 50s, that the head of the PLO office in Kuwait took his kids to my father's clinic. And so immediately when he saw me in the queue, he knew to call my dad to come and pick me up. And I remember that was my first kind of attempt at rebellion. And then the second attempt when I went to boarding school, and it was an absolute horrendous disaster because I was forced to walk around a boarding school in Oxfordshire in a shirt and tie and a jacket. And I first weekend away that I was allowed, I never went back. And I went back to Kuwait.
And then your children are not as rebellious because they've had a connection to the land, actually, that mitigates this, yes?
We made sure, Dima and I made sure that the kids go to Gaza every summer. And the last 2 years have been the first summers ever that they hadn't been. From the time Sliman was 9 months old, they would go to Gaza every summer. Because it's funny, you want to give your children what you never had, and what I never had is that childhood connection to the land. And so I wanted them to have that childhood connection to the land, not just the intellectual and the emotional connection to the cause.
And you describe that distinction as primarily being one that differentiates those who grow up close to the land and those who grow up in Bishatat.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I was in Beirut in 1992 and 1982, and we were probably the same age. And I probably didn't have as much of a consciousness as you to want to, because you were maybe elsewhere, and it was I remember vividly those days, and I was also in Beirut in 2006, right on both times on the line.
2006 is the only war I did not go to because Sliman had been 2 years old, and I went into a kind of almost like an existential crisis in thinking, should you be doing this with a child? And so I didn't go. And by the time the 2009 war came, I resolved that and decided, yes, you do, because you have to be true to yourself before you can be true to your kids.
Well, I think on that, I think it's a good lesson for all of us, and also the ways that we show up and how we can show up with integrity, especially in moments when that's for sale and also for survival.
Ghassan, I don't know what to tell you, but thank you so much for sitting with us and sharing. I know that Noura and I can speak with you for much longer time, and we've already met and talked, and we probably will talk again. But thanks for sharing this with us and with a lot of people who will be paying attention, listening, watching. And thanks to Noura for being my co-host.
Thank you for letting me join you.
أهلا وسهلا.
Yeah.
Usually it's Mu'in Rabbani. I took permission from Mu'in.
Thank you, Maureen.
Yeah, and we actually hope we don't talk to you again about these things,
Yeah.
so that maybe they will not happen. But something tells me, based on what's happening today,
Absolutely.
next door in Syria, and
Today
what's been
is-
happening is unbelievable.
It's part of it is thoroughly humiliating, and I don't think I felt like crying as much as I did today from the scene, because we don't have any affinity to a Ministry of Defense, but that sense of national humiliation, that sense of what they call in Arabic al-istibaha, watching that happen. But at the same time, a sense that Zionism has become an ideology with no ideas other than killing. And it's like when you only have a single note to play, and it's the same note you keep playing over and over again because you're devoid of any other notes.
And even when the other is actually trying to speak with you, like exactly what happened today.
Literally, it's when you cannot, there are certain illnesses, neurological illnesses, where people lose the ability to sense anything other than pain. So temperature is interpreted as pain, touch is interpreted as pain. Israelis, it's that kind of disease where everything is interpreted as the need for violence, and you lose all the tools. And so you become reduced to a tactic rather than you have under your disposal a series or a milieu of tactics. You can just do this. And so that's all you do. Not because it's your go-to plan, because you have now been reduced to this, which is a continuous violence.
And you can graft this onto campuses in the US where even critique of Israel killing is received as pain and harm to the listener who supports Israel.
I was just going to say that I have a dear friend, therapist, so along the same, medicine as well, who describes that we have the same reaction to discomfort and danger, that the nervous system reacts in the same way. So that these students, literally because of the function of being uncomfortable, are claiming danger, and yet because of their sensibilities mattering more.
Yes.
That now we have Columbia University just today putting out a new, very clear code of student conduct. I mean, this pales in comparison to this broader question, but very clear code of student conduct that any attack on Zionism will be interpreted as part of a harassment policy.
But nobody draws the analogy with the fact that there are white people who become uncomfortable when they see black people in the same train carriage, and they feel danger through the presence of black people.
Sheer presence, yes.
Hey.
Well, shall we release Dr.
We
Ghassan?
will, but I also want to say that I wouldn't give them that much credit. I do think that there's a lot that we don't know about, and we're seeing that now. I mean, claims of white genocide are not only real, but they're being acted upon.
What I'm saying is that there's no link between that being interpreted as just a form of racism and that being interpreted as a form of racism. That if you say, I don't want to be in this train carriage because there's an African or a Chinese person, you're labeled as a racist. But if you say that I do not want to be in this space because these people look Palestinian or wear Palestinian cultural icons, you're not labeled as a racist.
Yeah. These are the logics of, racism as a narrative as well. Anyway, we keep trying to end this. Obviously, we don't want to. We'll certainly continue, and I know that the conversation will continue because Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah is now going to be training a whole new generation of doctors in war zones, and so this is also continuing this legacy of liberation medicine.
Absolutely.
شكرا غسان دكتور غسان.
شكرا يعطيك العافيه.
الله يعافيك.
فيك بقى تطلبي بالطاوله كل ما حضرتي عم بيطلع بالاوديو.
انا ما قلت لي من الاول.
عيب. سلام.
Yeah.